At well below zero, Ed Harlan's ranch chimney poured smoke across the Nebraska prairie. Half a mile away, a low house sheltering 4 families showed almost none. One heater served all 4 rooms, and the fire had been out for an hour. Ed walked across the frozen grass to prove the house was failing. When he opened the door to the farthest room, warm air touched his ice-stiff beard. There was no stove in the room, no stovepipe, no roaring fire. On the table, under a cloth, a bowl of bread dough was rising. The people and exact incident in this story are fictional. The material problems, masonry, heater logic, and basic physics are historically grounded, but this is not a documented Nebraska case. The story began the previous spring, when Gustav Reimer bought a small parcel on the edge of the sandhills and announced that he intended to build a winter house for 4 families. Not 4 cabins, 1 winter house. That distinction mattered to Gustav, although almost no one else understood it. He was in his late 30s, broad through the shoulders, quiet in company, and much more comfortable with clay, brick, and smoke than with arguments. Before coming west, he had worked around kiln yards and masonry stoves in Volga German settlements, where a household might spend more effort storing heat in brick than keeping flame alive in iron. On the plains, that sounded backward. The settlers around him knew one reliable rule about winter: make the house small, put the stove near the middle, and keep feeding it. Ed Harlan had lived by that rule for 22 winters. He owned a modest cattle place west of the Reimer parcel, and had the hard confidence of a man who had survived storms by expecting everything to fail. He kept extra harness leather, spare fence staples, sacks of flour, and more firewood than his wife thought reasonable. When he heard what Gustav planned, he rode over to see it for himself. There were stakes in the ground describing a low square, roughly 40 feet across. Instead of one open interior, 4 private household rooms would occupy the outer corners. A common brick hall would sit in the middle. Short interior passages would connect each room to that hall. The north and west sides would be protected by packed earth and storage walls. One broad roof would cover the entire structure, and in the center of the common hall, Gustav had marked the foundation for one massive masonry heater. Ed stared at the chalk lines. 1 chimney, he asked. 1 heater, Gustav said. For 4 households. Gustav nodded. Ed looked at the other men helping with the foundation. Lewis Carter, who farmed a narrow strip near a creek. Otto Weiss, a teamster with 2 daughters. And Samuel Brooks, a widower who repaired wagon wheels and lived with his sister and young son. All 3 had agreed to put labor and money into Gustav's plan. Ed turned back to him. So if your heater fails, 4 families get cold at once? Yes, Gustav said. The answer surprised him. Gustav did not pretend the risk did not exist. Ed pointed toward the empty center square. And if one family wants more heat, they open the upper vent, and if they want less, they close it. And if Carter decides he is tired of carrying wood, Lewis Carter laughed from the trench, then my wife will solve the problem before Gustav has to. The men smiled, but Ed did not. He had seen partnerships collapse over grazing rights, wells, fences, and 15 feet of disputed property line. To him, Gustav was not only building a complicated heater, he was building a house that required 4 families to cooperate during the exact season when mistakes could kill them. A man ought to be able to keep his own children warm, Ed said. Gustav pushed his shovel into the soil. That is why we are building it. The year before, Gustav had tried the usual way. He and his wife, Marta, had rented a board cabin near the rail spur. Their two children, Lena and Peter, slept in a corner behind a blanket partition. The cabin had a small cast iron stove. On mild days it was tolerable. On hard nights it behaved like a machine for turning split cottonwood into smoke and anxiety. The iron body heated fast and cooled fast. Near the stove the air could feel painfully hot. Across the room, water along the wall could skin with ice. Every time a gust pushed through the warped boards, the flame in the lamp moved. Gustav hated that movement. Not because it was uncomfortable, because it was information. The house was losing heat faster than the stove could replace it. He had spent years watching kilns and masonry heaters work on a different principle. The goal was not to maintain a weak flame all night. The goal was to burn a smaller number of hot, clean fires and force the heat through a heavy masonry path before the exhaust reached the chimney. The brick absorbed that energy and released it slowly for hours. A mass of warm brick did not go cold the moment the flame disappeared. That was the first idea Gustav brought to the new house. The second was more important. He stopped treating every family room as a separate box standing alone in the wind. In a normal cabin, every wall might face winter. In Gustav's plan, much of each family's wall area faced the protected common interior. The outer shell took the weather. The private rooms hid behind it. The central hall was not just a place for a heater. It was a buffer between the families and the prairie. The third idea was air movement. Near the top of each private room, Gustav planned a shuttered opening into the common hall. Near the floor, he planned a second, smaller return opening. Warm air from the hall could enter high. Cooler room air could move back low. No smoke was supposed to travel through those openings. The fire and flue gases remained sealed inside the heater and chimney. Only room air circulated. It was simple in a sketch. Nothing on the prairie stayed simple once wind touched it. Construction took most of the summer. They dug the central heater foundation deeper than the others because the brick mass would weigh far more than a sheet iron stove. They used fieldstone at the base, locally fired brick where they could afford it, and clay mortar in non-critical areas where Gustav knew how to work it. The roof stayed low. The northern storage wall held sacks, tools, and stacked fuel, adding another layer between the living rooms and the worst winter wind. The families did not share bedrooms or money. Each household kept its own private room and its own door to the outside. But the center belonged to everyone. That was where they stacked a week's wood at a time. That was where wet coats would hang. That was where Marta Reimer and Ruth Carter argued over how many shelves the common cupboard needed. That was where the children learned, long before the adults did, that the building was not 4 houses or 1 house. It was something in between. Ed Harlan rode by often enough to make his opinion impossible to forget. "Still building your brick stomach?" he called once. Gustav was inside the heater core, setting a baffle that would force hot gases to change direction before entering the chimney path. "A stomach uses fuel," Gustav called back. Ed leaned on the saddle horn. "And what does yours do?" "Tries not to waste it." By October, the roof was closed. The common hall smelled of fresh pine, clay dust, and brick. The 4 high vents were fitted with simple wooden shutters. The low returns were smaller and protected by grills. Each family room had a window on an outside wall, but fewer exposed surfaces than a standalone cabin of the same living area. Gustav waited before lighting the heater hard. Fresh masonry had to dry. that patience became another target for jokes. "Built the biggest stove in the county and is afraid to use it," Ed said. But Gustav knew wet masonry punished haste. He started with small curing fires, then larger ones as the weeks passed. The first true cold snap came in November. The temperature fell overnight. By dawn, the grass was white, and the water troughs had a thin lid of ice. Gustav decided it was time for a full firing. The families gathered in the common hall while he stacked dry splits inside the firebox. He lit them. The draft caught. Flame climbed bright and fast. For 10 minutes, everything worked. Then the wind shifted. Smoke pushed from a clean-out seam near the base of the heater. Marta smelled it first. "Gustav." He turned and saw a blue-gray thread curling along the brick. Then another. He opened the hall door and ordered everyone outside. No debate, no pride, no attempt to save face. The 4 families stood in the frost while Gustav killed the fire and watched smoke hesitate in the flue instead of climbing cleanly. Ed Harlan happened to be passing with a wagon. He stopped. He looked at the adults in coats, the children wrapped in blankets, and the smoke leaking from the center of the house. He did not laugh. That made it worse. "This is what I was afraid of," he said. Gustav's face was gray with anger, mostly at himself. "So was I." Ed studied him. "You want help taking it apart?" "No." "Then what?" Gustav looked up at the chimney, then toward the roof ridge and the direction of the wind. "I want to know why it failed." That afternoon, while the others moved into temporary quarters, Gustav climbed the roof with a length of rope and a weighted scrap of cloth. He watched how the wind spilled over the low roof and tumbled behind the ridge. He had built the chimney to a height that would have worked in calmer country. On the open plains, the roof itself was creating a dirty pocket of air around the top of the stack. The chimney was not simply too small or too large. It was standing in the wrong air. Gustav tore down the upper portion and rebuilt it higher so the outlet cleared the turbulent zone. He tightened the clean-out doors and reworked the throat where the heater entered the vertical flue. Then he waited for another windy day. The second full firing drew cleanly. No smoke entered the hall, but the house still had another problem. The central hall grew warm while Samuel Brooks's corner room stayed disappointingly cool. Ed heard about that too. "One problem at a time," he said. "Soon as you fix the smoke, the heat forgets where to go." Gustav could not argue. The high vent in Samuel's room was open. Warm air was entering, but slowly. The low return was too small and partly blocked by a trunk placed against the wall. Without an easy path back, circulation stalled. Gustav moved the trunk, enlarged the low opening, and adjusted the other rooms so each had a clear upper path in and lower path out. That evening, Samuel tied a thin strip of paper near the top vent. It lifted gently inward. Near the floor, another strip moved the opposite direction. No fan, no pump. Just warm air rising, cooler air sinking, and a building shape to let that cycle continue. The far room took longer to warm than the center. Gustav wrote that down in a small notebook. It mattered. The winter house was not magic. It could not make every room identical. It could not create heat from nothing. It could not survive neglect simply because the walls were clever. It needed dry fuel. It needed a clean flue. It needed clear air paths. And it needed 4 households willing to follow the same rules. By December, the families had made those rules visible. A small slate hung in the common hall. Each household marked its turn carrying wood, removing ash, checking shutters, and inspecting the flue doors. The children were forbidden to touch the heater openings. Wet coats stayed on one rack, fuel stayed off the brick. The arrangement looked communal, but it was not casual. Cooperation had become part of the heating system. The firing routine changed too. Instead of nursing a smoky little flame all night, Gustav burned the masonry heater hard for a shorter period, then let the brick mass carry the rooms through the long hours after the fire was gone. In severe cold, they fired it more often. In milder weather, they waited longer between burns. The important thing was not how impressive the flames looked. It was how slowly the stored heat disappeared. Marta found the first proof in bread. In the old cabin, winter dough had to be placed almost against the iron stove. Too close, the outside dried. Too far, it sat heavy and cold. In the new house, she could set a covered bowl on a shelf in the family room. After the morning firing, the rise was slower than summer, but it happened. That small domestic fact impressed her more than any lecture about heat. Ed remained unconvinced. He admitted the place was warmer than he expected in December. But December was not the test. Wait until the north wind stops playing, he said. Wait until it means it. The north wind meant it in February. The storm arrived after a day of hard gray sky. Snow came sideways before dark, not deep at first, but fast enough to erase the wagon tracks between farms. By midnight, the temperature had fallen far below zero. The wind packed snow against every fence, wall, and doorway it could find. Travel became dangerous. Animals needed feed, water needed protection, and every house became its own small mechanical system under stress. At the Harlan ranch, Ed did what he had always done. He fed the iron stove, then he fed it again. His house was better than the board cabin Gustav had rented the year before. The walls were tighter, the roof was sound, but the stove still demanded attention, and the wind still found the weak places. By the second day, Ed's wife, Clara, had moved a chair away from the north wall because the draft made her legs ache. Their grandson Ben, staying with them while his mother was ill in town, slept on a pallet near the kitchen. Ed's woodpile was shrinking. That alone did not frighten him. He had plenty. What frightened him was the sound he heard that evening when he opened the stove door, a faint metallic tick, then another. The collar where the stovepipe entered the chimney had shifted and cracked along one edge. Ed saw a thin trace of smoke where no smoke belonged. He closed the stove down immediately. He knew enough about winter to understand the choice. A cold house was dangerous. A leaking flue could be worse. He could patch it, but not with confidence in that wind and darkness. He needed another heated room until daylight, and there was only one place close enough to reach on foot. The winter house. Ed wrapped Ben in 2 coats, put Clara in his heaviest wool cloak, and led them through the blowing snow. The trip took far longer than half a mile should take. Halfway there, Ed stopped to catch his breath. That was when he looked back. His ranch chimney had gone nearly dark after he shut down the stove. Then he looked forward. Gustav's chimney showed only a thin gray breath. For a moment, Ed thought the heater must also be failing. He pushed on faster. Lewis Carter opened the outer door before they knocked twice. Warm air moved into the entry. Not furnace hot, not the dry blast Ed expected near a roaring iron stove. Just steady warmth. They brought Clara and Ben into the common hall. The masonry heater stood in the middle, like a blocky brick column. Its surface was warm. There was no visible flame. "Where's the fire?" Ed asked. "Finished an hour ago," Gustav said. Ed stared at him, then lighted again. "Not yet. You have 3 families and mine standing in here? Gustav laid his palm on the brick. The fire is in the walls now. Ed would have called that nonsense if he had not been able to feel it himself. The brick did not scorch his hand. It radiated a broad, patient warmth. The hall around it was comfortable even though no flame was burning. Marta took Clara toward the Reimers' room. Ruth Carter led Ben to the far corner room, where Samuel Brooks's sister had cleared a place for him. Ed followed. He wanted the worst room. If Gustav's system had a lie in it, Ed expected to find the lie at the outer corner, farthest from the heater. The room was cooler than the hall, but it was not cold. The window had a faint rim of frost near the edge. The floor near the outside wall was chilly. No one pretended otherwise. Yet the air in the room was a little above 60 degrees by the small wall thermometer Samuel used for his varnish work. There was no stove, no stovepipe. On the table sat a covered bowl of bread dough, swelling slowly under a flour cloth. Ed looked at it for several seconds. Then he walked to the upper wall vent. A soft current of warm air entered from the common hall. He crouched and held his fingers near the lower grill. Cooler air moved back toward the center. The house was breathing in a loop, not through cracks, through paths Gustav had chosen. Ed stood up. For years he had thought of heat as something a stove threw into a room. Here the stove was not in the room at all. The heater charged the brick. The brick warmed the central air and nearby surfaces. The building protected that warmth from wind. The upper and lower openings allowed the rooms to exchange air with the center. The private spaces were not exposed boxes fighting winter alone. They were pockets inside one sheltered shell. The important trick was not producing extraordinary heat. It was giving ordinary heat fewer ways to escape. Ed returned to the common hall. "How much wood?" he asked. Gustav pointed to the rack and the larger storage stack beyond it. The 4 families were still using serious fuel. No one had defeated winter. But their pile was falling more slowly than Ed expected because they were not keeping 4 separate iron stoves hot through every hour of the night. They also had a cost Ed had not understood before. 4 households depended on the same masonry core. If the chimney failed, all 4 had a problem. If the air paths were blocked, the corner rooms cooled. If someone burned wet fuel or neglected cleaning, everyone shared the consequence. The design had traded 4 independent heating problems for one shared system that demanded maintenance and trust. Gustav had never denied that. Ed had simply assumed dependence was the weakness. That night, dependence was what kept Clara and Ben warm after his own stove had to be shut down. The storm held another day. Ed helped carry wood because there was nothing else to do. He watched Otto Weiss inspect the flue door before the evening firing. He watched Samuel clear snow from the protected outer entry. He watched Marta close one upper shutter after the Reimer room became too warm. No one treated the house like a miracle. They treated it like equipment. Every useful thing had limits. Every limit had a chore attached to it. When the evening fire burned, it burned bright. Gustav did not choke it down into a long, dirty smolder. The heat moved through the masonry path before the exhaust rose away. Later, after the burn was safely finished, the brick kept giving back what it had stored. Outside, the wind kept spending itself against one outer shell. Inside, 4 households adjusted shutters, shared a fuel pile, and slept. By the time the weather cleared, Ed had stopped asking whether the system worked. He had started asking which parts of it could work elsewhere. That question mattered more. The winter house was too expensive and too cooperative for every homesteader. A family already living miles from neighbors could not simply drag 3 other households into a square and rebuild from the ground up. A poorly built masonry heater could be dangerous. A bad chimney could smoke. A neglected flue could turn a clever plan into a hazard. Gustav's solution was not a universal house plan. It was a set of principles made visible in one building. Store heat instead of only chasing flame. Reduce exposed surface where possible. Protect living space from direct wind. Give warm air and cool air deliberate paths. Treat maintenance as part of the design. And where people were already sharing risk, let the building admit that reality instead of pretending each room was an island. Ed took those ideas home. He repaired his stove connection first. Then, when spring arrived, he rebuilt the bunkhouse where 2 hired men slept during calving season. He did not copy Gustav's winter house. He could not afford to. Instead, he enclosed the drafty passage that had separated the sleeping room from the cookroom. He moved the stove so its heat reached a new interior brick wall. He added a high transfer opening and a low return between the 2 rooms. He stacked feed and tools against the north service wall instead of leaving living space directly exposed to it. The next winter, the bunkhouse still used fuel. The men still woke early to tend stock, but the room no longer went from roasting to freezing every time the iron stove cycled. Other neighbors borrowed different pieces. One family added an enclosed central entry that doubled as a wind buffer. Another built a heavier masonry surround behind its stove. Lewis Carter later helped a cousin arrange 2 rooms around one protected heated passage instead of putting separate stoves in both. No company sold a kit. No county changed its building code. No newspaper declared a revolution in prairie housing. The change was smaller and more believable than that. People who had once asked only how big a stove should be began asking where the heat went after the stove made it. Gustav kept his notebook. He wrote down which corner cooled first, which wind direction changed the draft, how often the chimney needed attention, and which shutters the children had left closed by mistake. The winter house improved not because its first design had been perfect. It improved because failure had been allowed to teach the builders something before the hardest weather arrived. By the following February, Ed Harlan no longer called it Gustav's brick stomach. He called it the courthouse because the 4 families still referred to the center as the court. On one cold morning, he stopped there on his way to town. No smoke rose from the chimney. The morning firing had ended hours earlier. Inside the far room, Marta had left a covered bowl on the table for Samuel's sister. Ed lifted one corner of the cloth. The dough had climbed nearly to the rim. He covered it again and walked out without saying anything. By sunrise, the chimney was cold, and in the far room, the dough had risen anyway.